The Last Grove of Athena, Chapter 1, The Geometry of Conquest. Winter had come early to the western coast, carrying the bitter scent of sea salt and starvation. Damon, chief architect of the dying borderlands, stood shivering beside his goddess. Athena did not feel the cold. She stood immaculate upon the frostbitten cliffs, her polished bronze armor catching the anemic sunlight, her gray eyes meticulously mapping the geometry of survival. Beneath them lay the blueprint of an empire's salvation, a sprawling, fortified harbor that would sever the chokehold of the pirate fleets, protect the grain routes, and feed Damon's starving children. To Athena, the math was infallible. But salvation required walls, and walls required fleets, and fleets required the ancient woodland bordering the coast. They needed the Grove of Mneme. Damon rubbed his soot-stained hands together, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. "They will not go back in, my lady." He did not look at the tree line. None of the mortal men did. The surveyors lose their minds in the fog. The iron axes, they rust to dust within hours of touching the bark. Damon swallowed hard, the pragmatism of a desperate father warring with primal terror. "And the men who do swing the blade, they do not return as soldiers. We found Cashin on his knees this morning, weeping uncontrollably over a stump. He said the wood was screaming." Athena surveyed the vast, impenetrable expanse of primordial cedar and black pine. It was an aberration. To the goddess of wisdom, civilization was a straight line drawn through the chaotic, violent wilderness. The grove was a sprawling, tangled insult to order. "A starving man's superstition," Athena said, her voice smooth and hard as grinding marble. "Wait here." She crossed the boundary where the frost-hardened gravel surrendered to thick, suffocating moss. The transition was violent. The biting wind and the chaotic, ringing clamor of the mortal encampment vanished, swallowed instantly by a heavy, green-tinted twilight. The air here was impossibly ancient, heavy with the scent of petrichor, sweet decay, and wet feathers. The silence was not empty, it was pressurized. It pressed against her divine consciousness like the crushing depths of the ocean. Every shadow felt deliberate. Every twisted root looked like a muscle held tense beneath the dark earth. Deep within this cathedral of ancient wood, Athena found the source of the resistance. It was a freshly felled cedar, its massive trunk cleaved by iron, oozing golden, fragrant sap onto the loam. Beside it knelt a woman. She was not the ethereal, delicate nymph of mortal poetry. She was grounded and feral, her skin the color of damp bark, her dark hair tangled with dead leaves and sawdust. Her bare hands were pressed flat against the bleeding stump, her shoulders trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a colossal, vibrating fury. "Stand up, spirit," Athena commanded, her divine authority echoing through the hollows as she rested a hand on her spear. "Your woods belong to the Empire now." The woman did not flinch. Without turning, she spoke. It was a language of clicking consonants and rolling vowels, a dead, pre-Bronze Age dialect of a civilization Athena herself had ordered burned to the ground 1,000 years ago. "You came back wearing bronze this time." Athena froze. Nature's spirits had been eradicated by expanding kingdoms centuries ago. Yet this woman rose, turning to face the goddess of strategy with eyes that held the terrifying, bottomless depth of a tar pit. Eirene, the last Dryad, wiped the tree's golden blood from her jaw. She looked at the gleaming armor, the terrible perfection of the divine architect, and asked the question that would eventually undo an empire. "Tell me, daughter of Zeus," Eirene whispered, her voice rustling like dead leaves over a grave. "Why do your cities always require something beautiful to die first?" Athena's grip tightened on her spear of celestial bronze until the leather binding groaned. She opened her mouth, a dozen strategic justifications rising to her tongue. The famine, the pirates, the mathematical certainty that without walls, Damon's children would perish. But here, beneath the crushing, watchful weight of the ancient pines, the words tasted like ash. They sounded not like wisdom, but like an excuse. For the first time in an age, the goddess of reason found herself without an answer. Her jaw set into a hard, rigid line. "Halt the axes," Athena commanded to the silence, her voice devoid of its usual ringing certainty. She did not look at the Dryad as she turned her back on the bleeding cedar. "We do not cut blindly into the dark. I will redraw the lines." She stepped out of the green twilight and back into the biting winter wind, carrying a question she could not defeat back to her command tent. Chapter 2, The Archive of Blood. Athena's command pavilion, a marvel of white silk and rigid bronze beams, stood stark against the creeping rod of the woodline. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of burning olive oil and parchment. Maps were spread across a heavy oak table, charting the exact, flawless geometry of Damon's harbor. It was a masterpiece of civil engineering, a testament to human defiance against a chaotic world. Yet the air outside the tent was infected. The ancient cedars of the Grove of Mneme did not sway in the wind. They seemed to breathe, a slow, heavy respiration that rattled the nerves of the mortal engineers. They huddled by their braziers, weapons drawn against shadows, whispering of weeping trees and voices in the underbrush. Athena demanded empirical proof of this supposed haunting. She was a goddess of logic and warfare. She did not believe in ghost stories. Leaving Damon to tend to his starving, terrified men, she stepped across the boundary line just as the afternoon sky bruised purple and the first drops of rain began to fall. It did not rain here as it did in the mortal world. The water did not cleanse, it resurrected. As a single drop struck the exposed skin of Athena's cheek, the geometric reality of her camp violently vanished. She was abruptly plunged into a sensory hallucination, so pure it stole the breath from her lungs. She was no longer standing in her polished armor. She was trapped beneath a canopy of black pines, her throat tearing open as a crude stone spear pierced it. She tasted hot, feral blood. She felt the phantom agony of a dying species, a cave wolf, massive and golden-eyed, bleeding out onto the moss centuries before the first human city was ever conceived. Athena stumbled backward, her hand instinctively flying to the hilt of her sword. The vision dissolved, leaving her trembling in the drizzling rain. She dragged a gauntlet across her lips. The rainwater tasted sharply of copper. It tasted of salt and iron. "They are louder when it storms," a voice murmured from the gloom. Eirene stepped from the hollow of an enormous, twisted root system. She was not wearing the bark and sap of the previous day. Today she wore a woven tunic the color of dead moss, her dark hair hanging heavy and wet against her collarbones. Her presence commanded the suffocating space, acting as an anchor to the shifting, screaming memories of the forest. "What manner of magic is this?" Athena demanded, her voice tight, betraying a fraction of the horror she felt. "What kind of illusion do you cast upon my men?" "There are no illusions here, daughter of Zeus," Eirene replied, her tone devoid of mockery. She stepped closer, closing the distance until Athena could smell the crushing weight of centuries on her skin, petrichor, ozone, and old sorrow. "The Grove of Mneme does not create. It archives. You just felt the last breath of the cave wolves. My roots drank their blood 3,000 years ago, and so I remember them. Just as I remember the boys your architect sent in with axes yesterday." Athena's mind, built for strategy and order, recoiled at the utter inefficiency of it. To carry the death of every beast, every fallen leaf, every spilled drop of blood, it is madness. It is a paralysis of the mind. To survive, you must let the dead remain dead. "And to build your walls, you must make more dead," Eirene countered smoothly. Her eyes, ancient and dark, flicked past Athena toward the mortal encampment where Damon's men shivered in the cold. "Your architect believes he is building salvation. But what of the coastal tribes who lived on these cliffs before your empire deemed them savages? I remember them. I felt their throats cut by your bronze swords. Your progress is merely consumption painted in the polite colors of necessity. Necessity is all that stands between humanity and the abyss." Athena's voice cracked like thunder, her divine aura flaring, a blinding, sterile white light pushing back the heavy green gloom. "Look at them, spirit. Damon's children are eating boiled leather to survive the winter. If I do not clear this forest and build that harbor, they will perish. The strong survive by making difficult choices. To lead armies, to build empires, one must compartmentalize grief. We build monuments to the fallen and we move forward." "You build monuments to assuage your own guilt," Eirene whispered. She stepped directly into Athena's blinding light, entirely unafraid. The physical proximity was intoxicating and terrifying, a clash of pristine, cold metal against damp, living earth. Eirene reached out, her mud-stained fingertips hovering mere inches from the polished chest plate of the goddess. "You do not mourn the dead, Athena," the Dryad said softly, her eyes searching the goddess's rigid face. "You replace them. You pave over their bones and call it a road." Athena stared into the Dryad's fathomless eyes. For the first time in millennia, she had no tactical countermeasure. She felt the agonizing weight of the rain. the sheer, crushing volume of suffering the woman before her endured just by drawing breath. It was a terrifying kind of strength, a strength Athena did not possess. Unable to bear the unyielding truth in Eirene's gaze, Athena turned away. Her jaw was set hard as she walked back toward the sterile, geometric safety of her silk pavilion. But as she crossed the tree line, Eirene's voice chased her through the falling rain, soft and devastating. "You think civilization remembers people, goddess. It only remembers victories." Chapter 3. The things buried beneath roots. The squall did not roll in from the sea, it erupted from the earth. By the time Athena realized the unnatural severity of the sudden, plummeting freeze, the boundary back to the mortal encampment had vanished, swallowed by a shifting labyrinth of black pines and blinding, horizontal sleet. Her celestial bronze armor, forged to deflect the crushing blows of war gods, became a deadly liability in the arcane cold. It acted as a thermal sink, drawing the warmth from her immortal blood until her joints locked and her breath crystallized into jagged plumes. For the first time in an epic, the goddess of strategy was outmaneuvered by the weather. "Step off the path!" Eirene's voice cut through the howling dark, sharp and urgent. The Dryad materialized from the blinding sleet, unaffected by the freezing rain that slicked her bare shoulders. She grabbed Athena by the vambrace. The sheer, shocking warmth of Eirene's skin bleeding through the freezing metal anchored Athena's fracturing focus. Without waiting for divine permission, Eirene pulled the trembling goddess deeper into the suffocating belly of the wood. They emerged from the storm into the heart of Mneme. Here, the sleet could not penetrate the canopy. Enormous, prehistoric cedars spiraled upward like the fluted columns of a subterranean cathedral, their colossal roots bridging over rivers of black moss. The air was entirely still, heavy with the scent of crushed juniper and ancient dust. But the heart was not empty. Driven by the violent kinetic energy of the storm outside, the grove's compressed memories had begun to rupture, bleeding out into the physical space. The darkness was illuminated by the bioluminescent glow of phantoms. Athena stood paralyzed. All around her, the translucent echoes of a million forgotten lives played out in the hollows of the roots. She saw a spectral Bronze Age woman desperately pressing a crying infant against her chest beneath a rotting log. A few yards away, two spectral soldiers, wearing the crests of kingdoms Athena had personally orchestrated the collapse of, held each other, bleeding out in the dark, their whispered prayers mingling with the wind. Extinct, golden-eyed wolves paced silently through the underbrush, their massive paws making no sound on the fallen leaves. It was an endless, weeping tapestry of collateral damage. It was the horrific, unedited ledger of progress. "They do not mean to frighten you," Eirene said softly, her voice echoing in the cavernous hollow. "The storm merely agitates the soil. The roots cannot contain the volume of what they have absorbed." Athena could not look away from the two dying soldiers. "It is an atrocity," she whispered, her teeth chattering beneath her helm. "To trap them here, to force them to loop their final agonies. They are not trapped. They are merely remembered," Eirene replied, her dark eyes reflecting the ghostly, silver light. "Because outside this tree line, your empire has built taverns and slaughterhouses over their graves. If I do not hold them, they cease to have ever existed." Eirene turned and waded deeper into the cathedral of trees. Numbed by the cold and the crushing psychological weight of the ghosts, Athena followed. They reached a recessed alcove at the base of a cliff face, sheltered entirely from the wind. Athena stopped abruptly. The geometric perfection of her mind snagged on a jarring botanical anomaly. Surrounded by towering, ancient cedars and dark pines stood a small cluster of trees that did not belong in this soil. They were gnarled, twisted, and shimmering with silver-green leaves, olive trees. Athena's breath hitched in her throat. A sudden, violent spike of panic pierced her chest, a sensation so alien it felt like a physical blade. She stepped forward, her armored hand trembling as she reached out to touch the closest trunk. The bark was rough, twisted by centuries of agonizingly slow growth. As her skin made contact, the surgically sealed vaults of her divine mind shattered. The memory hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She tasted ashes and burning flesh. She heard the deafening roar of the siege of Troy. She felt the heavy, lifeless weight of a mortal companion cradled in her arms, their blood staining her pristine white chiton. The unbearable, suffocating realization that all her wisdom, all her strategy, could not stitch a soul back into a ruined mortal body. She remembered fleeing the heavens, desperate to hide her weeping from the mocking eyes of Olympus. She remembered falling to her knees in this exact dirt, digging frantically with her bare, bloody hands to plant the pits of an olive, screaming her grief into the indifferent earth. And then, to survive the pain, she had chosen to amputate the memory entirely. Athena dropped to her knees, the celestial bronze ringing dully against the roots. She pressed her face into her hands, her shoulders heaving as a millennium of repressed, agonizing sorrow finally broke free. Eirene knelt beside her in the dark. She did not mock the goddess's shattered facade, nor did she flinch from the overwhelming aura of divine grief. Instead, she gently rested a warm, soil-stained hand against the polished bronze of Athena's back. "You came here once," Eirene whispered to the trembling goddess of wisdom, "to grieve where no one could see you. I kept them safe for you." Chapter 4. The Point of No Return. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world bruised and suffocatingly still. Athena emerged from the tree line as the first anemic light bled over the frozen horizon. She did not walk with the measured, terrifying cadence of a conqueror. For the first time since the Bronze Age, the goddess of strategy looked entirely undone. The immaculate white of her chiton was stained with the dark, heavy loam of the hidden olive grove from where she had fallen to her knees. Her celestial bronze greaves were caked in mud. But it was her eyes that made Damon, waiting anxiously by the dying watchfires, take an involuntary step backward. The impenetrable, geometric clarity of the goddess was gone. In its place was a raw, aching expanse. Athena brushed past her chief architect without a word, retreating into the command pavilion. She could still feel the phantom warmth of Eirene's soil-stained hand pressing against her spine, the gentle, devastating anchor that had held her together when a millennium of suppressed grief had threatened to tear her apart. Inside the tent, the air was stale. Athena stared down at the vast vellum blueprints of the harbor spread across the oak table. Before last night, she had looked at these charcoal lines and seen only mathematics, angles of defense, depths of draft, the calculated logistics of human survival. But Eirene had shattered the surgically sealed vaults of her mind. The compartmentalization had failed. Now, when Athena looked at the straight lines of the proposed aqueduct, she did not see flowing water. She saw the phantom blood of the soldiers whose dying prayers she had ignored. She saw the twisted roots of the olive trees she had planted in agony. The blueprint was no longer a promise of the future. It was a premeditated obituary. "My lady," Damon stood at the tent's entrance, shivering. He looked smaller today, his face hollowed by rationing, his eyes red-rimmed from the night's terrors. "The frost is hardening the soil. If we do not clear the southern quadrant today, we cannot lay the foundational pylons before the snows pack. We must resume the harvest." Athena traced the edge of the vellum with a trembling, armored finger. The memory of the weeping ghosts in the dark still clung to her, a raw wound she could no longer bandage with logic. "Halt the axes, Damon," Athena said. Her voice was quiet, hollowed out by the night's weeping. Damon froze. "Halt them for how long?" "Until I have determined a new path." "There is no new path." Desperation in the mortal's voice fractured his reverence. He stepped forward, gesturing wildly toward the dark, freezing camp. "The men are boiling their leather scabbards for broth. If we delay, the pirate fleets will blockade the Narrows before spring. My children, our people, will starve. We cannot surrender to a haunted wood." "I have spoken," Athena said, though the words lacked their usual celestial thunder. Damon stared at her. His eyes dropped to the dark, undeniable dirt on the knees of her armor. The absolute trust that had once anchored his gaze dissolved into a terrible, creeping realization. He bowed stiffly, his jaw clenched tight, and backed out into the cold. Night fell early, wrapping the camp in a shroud. Athena remained in her tent, the silence of her own paralyzed mind pressing against the silk walls. Then the wind shifted. It did not carry the scent of frost or sea salt. It carried the sharp, acrid stench of sulfur, burning pitch, and ignited pine. Athena tore through the tent flap. At the edge of the camp, a dozen of Damon's most desperate veterans had broken rank. Driven mad by the whispering wood and the looming specter of starvation, they had taken up torches. They were marching across the gravel boundary, hurling fire into the ancient, dry underbrush of the Grove of Mneme. Athena did not run. She moved with the blinding, terrifying speed of divinity. The transition into the woods was an assault on the senses. The forest was screaming. It was not the crackle of burning wood. It was the synchronized, agonizing wail of 3,000 years of trapped memory catching fire. The ghosts of the forest flickered frantically in the orange light, writhing in the smoke. "Burn the witchwood," a veteran roared, hurling a clay pot of oil against the trunk of a massive cedar. "Hold!" Athena's voice struck like a physical blow, shaking the frost from the canopy, but the hysteria of the starving men had eclipsed their piety. Through the billowing smoke, Athena saw her. Eirene was on her knees in the dirt, exactly where she had comforted Athena hours before. But now, as the outer perimeter burned, the Dryad's physical form mirrored the destruction. Her skin was blistering and cracking, glowing with the horrific ember-orange heat of the burning cedars. She was gasping, choking on the ashes of her own burning archive. A mortal soldier raised an iron-banded axe, stepping toward the choking Dryad to finish the slaughter. Athena did not think of the empire. She did not think of the harbor, or the logic of survival, or the decrees of Olympus. The goddess of strategy drew her celestial spear, stepped between the mortal soldier and the Dryad, and drove the butt of her weapon into the earth. A shockwave of pure, kinetic divine force erupted from the impact point. The blast snuffed out the torches instantly. It shattered the soldiers' bronze swords into shrapnel. It lifted the men off their feet and hurled them backward into the mud with the sickening crack of fractured ribs and shattered collarbones. Sudden, suffocating silence slammed back down over the grove, broken only by the groans of the crippled soldiers and the hiss of dying embers. Athena stood breathing heavily in the dark, her spear lowered, her divine aura flaring a violent, defensive white. At the edge of the tree line, the smoke cleared to reveal a single figure standing in the frost. Damon held a trembling lantern. The architect stared at the ruined bodies of his loyal men. He looked at the goddess of wisdom, who stood with her back turned to humanity, fiercely guarding the bleeding, soot-stained embodiment of the wilderness. The line was crossed. The empire had lost its architect of war. Chapter 5. Olive branches and cedar hands. The lantern in Damon's trembling hand shattered against the frozen gravel. The mortal architect did not speak a word of treason, nor did he beg. He simply looked at the ruined bodies of his veterans, looked at the terrifying, glowing silhouette of his goddess, and turned away. He fled into the freezing dark, leaving Athena alone at the edge of the smoking boundary. Athena dropped her spear. The celestial bronze hit the earth with a dull, heavy thud. She turned back to Eirene. The Dryad had collapsed entirely, her physical form ravaged by the torches. The bark-like texture of her skin was cracked and blistering, glowing with an angry, subcutaneous ember heat. She was gasping, each breath a jagged rasp as she choked on the phantom smoke of the ruined outer trees. Athena did not hesitate. The goddess of strategy fell to her knees in the ash, sliding her arms beneath Eirene's shoulders and the crook of her knees. Eirene cried out, a sound like splitting timber, as Athena lifted her against the cold, unyielding plates of her celestial armor. "Hold on," Athena whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its divine echo. "Let me carry you." Athena carried the bleeding heart of the forest away from the stench of sulfur and burning pitch, plunging deeper into the absolute sanctuary of the heart of Mneme. She did not stop until the air grew thick with the scent of damp moss, and the canopy parted just enough to let a single, sharp shaft of moonlight pierce the gloom. They reached a shallow, silver pool cradled by the roots of a colossal cedar. Here, hidden from the cruelty of the mortal world, grew a carpet of bioluminescent, spectral flowers, blossoms of pale violet and ghostly white that pulsed softly in the dark. Athena laid Eirene gently upon the bank. The Dryad was violently shivering, her burns radiating a feverish heat. "My armor," Athena muttered, her hands moving with frantic precision. "It is too cold. It is burning you." She tore at the leather bindings. The heavy bronze cuirass, the vambraces, the greaves, the impenetrable shell that had defined her existence for millennia, clattered uselessly onto the wet stone. Stripped down to a simple, ash-stained chiton, Athena waded knee-deep into the freezing pool. She tore a strip of pristine white silk from her garment, soaked it in the glacial water, and returned to Eirene's side. With agonizing care, the goddess began to clean the ash from the Dryad's blistering skin. "They only bloom here," Eirene whispered, her voice barely a thread, her eyes locked on the glowing violet petals brushing against Athena's bare knees. "The night orchids. Your mortals hunted them to extinction for the dye. The grove kept the memory." Athena's hands stalled. She stared down at the devastating beauty of the extinct flowers and then at the terrible burns marring Eirene's skin. The sheer volume of the world's loss pressed against her throat, choking her. "You saw what they did tonight," Athena said, her voice shaking with a terrifying vulnerability. She pressed the cool cloth to Eirene's shoulder. "That is why I build the walls, Eirene. If I do not bind them with laws, if I do not give them structure and stone, they devour themselves. They devour the world. That is humanity without a spear to guide them." "And what are they with the spear, Athena?" Eirene countered weakly, though her dark eyes burned with sudden, fierce intensity. She reached up, her soot-stained fingers wrapping around Athena's wrist. "They still burn the world. They just do it in straight lines. They just call it necessity. Would you have me let them freeze?" "Let Damon's children starve in the dark." Athena's voice cracked, a desperate, rising panic taking hold. "I cannot fix this world without breaking the earth. I cannot forge peace without war. Then it is not peace." Eirene pushed herself up, ignoring the agony of her skin, closing the distance between them until they were breathing each other's air. "It is just a silence you bought with blood. At what point does your survival become simple, endless greed? I do not know." Athena screamed, the confession tearing from her chest, shattering the quiet of the ancient wood. The silence that followed was deafening. Athena trembled, her flawless face contorted with the absolute, agonizing terror of a god who had realized her omniscience was a lie. She was drowning, and the only solid thing left in the universe was the bruised, burning woman in front of her. The tension between them snapped. Athena did not lean in, she crashed into her. The kiss was not gentle. It was an angry, desperate collision, a catastrophic merging of cosmic opposites. It tasted of ozone and hot copper, of wet earth and crushed petals. Athena's hands tangled in Eirene's dark, sap-heavy hair, holding her with the terrifying, possessive grip of a warrior who had finally found something she refused to sacrifice. Eirene's arms wrapped around Athena's neck, pulling the goddess down into the loam, matching her desperation with a feral, weeping hunger. It was a kiss forged in the ruins of an empire, fueled by the mutual terror of the war they had just guaranteed. When they finally broke apart, gasping for the heavy, moonlit air, their foreheads rested against one another. Athena's immaculate skin was smeared with soot and dirt. Eirene's burns were cooled by the tears falling from the goddess's eyes. They sat together in the glowing dark of the extinct orchids, fully aware of the tragic reality they had just sealed. Athena had chosen the grove. And in doing so, she had drawn the wrath of the entire mortal and divine world upon them both. They were entirely, devastatingly alone. Chapter 6. The Gods Declare War. The peace of the hidden spring lasted exactly until dawn. It was not the sun that broke the green-tinted twilight of the Grove of Mneme. It was a piercing, unnatural radiance, the arrogant, blinding gold of Olympus. It descended like a physical weight, crushing the bioluminescence of the night orchids and turning the morning mist into choking steam. Athena stood immediately, her muscles locking as the suffocating pressure of absolute divine authority filled the cathedral of ancient cedars. The scent of damp earth was obliterated by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and celestial fire. The air itself ripped open, and the voice of Zeus rolled through the hollows, vibrating in the marrow of Athena's bones. "You shatter the swords of your own worshippers, daughter. You draw mortal blood to protect weeds. I protect the balance," Athena shouted into the blinding light, stepping protectively in front of Eirene, who was clutching her chest as the ozone burned her lungs. "They were starving, they were mad. I will not allow my empire to be built on the ashes of the earth's memory." "Memory," the thunder cracked, a sound of absolute derisive fury. "Do not feign ignorance, architect. You know what this forest is." Athena felt a sudden, sickening drop in her stomach. She looked at Eirene, who was trembling, her dark eyes reflecting the terrifying golden light. It was never about the harbor. Olympus did not care if a few thousand mortals starved in the winter. Olympus cared about the archive. The gods survived on myth. They curated their own histories, demanding worship for their benevolence while erasing their atrocities. But the Grove of Mneme remembered everything. It remembered the wailing of the innocent women, turned to monsters by divine spite. It remembered the great floods that drowned entire continents on a whim. It held the unedited, brutal truth of divine cruelty. "It is a cancer of history," Zeus's voice boomed, the pressure cracking the bark of the surrounding trees. "And you will excise it. Burn the heart tree before the sun sets, Athena. Turn the Dryad to ash. If you refuse, I will strip your aegis. I will seal your temples, and we will send the fires of heaven to raze this coast to the bedrock." The golden light vanished with a violent implosion, plunging the grove back into sudden, breathless gloom. Athena stood frozen in the ringing silence. The ultimatum was absolute. To disobey Zeus was not merely exile, it was the unmaking of her existence as the goddess of wisdom. But the silence did not last. From the far perimeter, miles away at the edge of the woodline, came a sound that made Athena's blood run cold. It was faint, rhythmic, and terribly precise. It was the sound of 100 iron axes striking wood simultaneously. Athena turned to Eirene. The Dryad gasped, her back arching as a sudden, phantom agony tore through her torso. She dropped to her knees, coughing up a mouthful of golden, fragrant sap that splattered against the dark moss. "Damon!" Athena whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. At the edge of the camp, the mortal architect had not surrendered to his fear. He had weaponized his despair. Facing the reality that their goddess had abandoned them, Damon had rallied the starving, freezing legions. He had told them the truth. There was no divine salvation coming. If they wanted to survive the winter, if they wanted their children to live, they had to butcher the haunted wood themselves. The invasion had begun. With every outer tree that fell to Damon's desperate men, Eirene suffered the execution. She convulsed on the ground, clutching at the soil, gasping for air as the memories of the fallen trees flooded her mind, drowning her in a chorus of screaming, displaced ghosts. "Athena!" Eirene choked out, her fingers digging into the goddess's bare ankle. They are tearing the roots." Athena dropped to her knees, catching Eirene's trembling frame. The Dryad's skin, which had begun to cool, was flaring again with an agonizing, subterranean heat as divine lightning began to strike the northern ridges. Olympus was already softening the defenses. Caught between the wrath of her father and the desperate brutality of her own people, Athena looked down at her discarded celestial armor. It lay in a heap on the moss, stained with the ash of her rebellion. She had worn that bronze to conquer kingdoms. She had worn it to tear down the walls of Troy and shatter the fleets of empires. Athena reached for the heavy breastplate. Her face, previously twisted in panic and grief, hardened into the terrifying, absolute stillness of the goddess of war. "I will not burn the tree," Athena swore, her voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating whisper as she secured the leather straps over her shoulders. She pulled Eirene against her breastplate, letting the Dryad feel the steady, unyielding thrum of her immortal heart. "And I will not let them take you." Chapter 7. The Heart Tree. The invasion did not sound like a war. It sounded like an execution. The rhythmic, sickening thwack of Damon's iron axes echoed from the southern perimeter, blending with the deafening, percussive roar of celestial artillery striking the northern ridges. The Grove of Mneme was bleeding from two fronts. The air grew thick with the stench of vaporized sap, burning pine, and the panicked, shrieking chorus of 1,000 displaced ghosts fleeing the perimeter. Athena stood at the absolute epicenter, the base of the colossal heart tree. Her celestial bronze armor, previously a symbol of imperial conquest, was now the only shield standing between the archive of the earth and total annihilation. At her feet, Eirene was barely conscious. The Dryad's breath came in ragged, wet gasps, her skin cracking and oozing golden resin as the outer rings of her forest were systematically butchered. Then, the canopy above them tore open. It was not a natural breach. The ancient, interlocking branches of the prehistoric cedars were violently ripped apart by a column of blood-red light. From the blinding tear in the sky descended Ares. The god of war did not land with grace. He struck the loam like a meteor, the impact cratering the ancient moss and sending a shockwave of pure, unadulterated bloodlust rippling through the clearing. Behind him, pouring through the shattered tree line, came the divine vanguard of Olympus, their weapons drawn. And dragging behind them, driven mad by the divine aura and freezing desperation, came Damon's mortal legion. "You bleed for firewood, sister." Ares laughed, his voice a jagged, grinding metal that scraped against the eardrums. He hefted his massive, spiked maul, his eyes burning with the manic thrill of an unsanctioned slaughter. "Father was right. The architect has lost her mind. Step aside, Athena. Let the mortals have their timber and let me burn the root." Athena leveled her spear. She did not shout. Her voice possessed the terrifying, absolute stillness of the eye of a hurricane. Take one step toward this tree, brother, and I will mathematically dismantle your immortality. Ares bared his teeth, raising his maul. The Olympian vanguard surged forward. Damon's starving men, eyes wide with terror and fanaticism, raised their axes. Athena braced her legs, preparing to do the unthinkable. She prepared to slaughter the mortals she had sworn to protect. She prepared to tear her own soul apart to save Eirene. No! The word was a fragile, papery rasp, but it cut through the din of the approaching army. Athena glanced down. Eirene had forced herself onto her knees. The Dryad was looking past Ares, her dark, agonizingly sad eyes fixed on Damon and the starving mortals behind him. She saw the absolute, uncompromising violence in Athena's posture. She knew that if Athena butchered her own people today, the goddess of wisdom would never survive the guilt. Eirene, stay down, Athena pleaded, her divine composure fracturing. You cannot save them by killing them, Athena, Eirene whispered, her voice suddenly devoid of pain, replaced by a terrifying, transcendent clarity. If you fight them with bronze, you are fighting their war. You must fight them with mine. Before Athena could stop her, Eirene lunged forward. She did not strike at Ares. She threw her ruined, burning arms around the colossal trunk of the heart tree. When your cities tell stories about victory, Eirene said, her voice amplifying, resonating not through the air but directly into the minds of every living being in the grove. Who remembers what was destroyed to build them? Eirene drove her thumbs into the ancient bark. She did not defend the archive. She voluntarily shattered its containment. The Dryad screamed, a sound that split the heavens and tore the heart tree open. There was no explosion of fire. There was a psychic detonation of absolute, unfiltered empathy. 3,000 years of compressed memory, grief, love, and extinction violently depressurized. A shockwave of pure, blinding silver light erupted from the ruptured cedar, washing over Athena, sweeping over Ares, and slamming into the advancing armies. It hit the mortals and gods not as a physical force, but as a torrential flood of consciousness. In a fraction of a second, the air was entirely displaced by ghosts. The clearing was packed with the spectral forms of extinct golden wolves, slaughtered Mycenaean children, forgotten mothers, and weeping soldiers. But they were not merely visual. As the shockwave hit Damon's men, their axes fell from their hands. They were suddenly, violently forced to feel the exact, agonizing physical and emotional pain of the trees they had just cut down. They felt the terror of the birds whose nests had plummeted. They felt the grief of the tribes slaughtered on the cliff centuries ago. Eirene surrendered her immortality, letting her physical form dissolve into glowing, floating ash to release the ultimate weapon. She forced the architects of war to finally feel the full, agonizing weight of consequence. Chapter 8. The Weaponization of Wisdom. The shockwave did not break the earth, nor did it shatter the sky. It broke the mind. As the blinding silver light of Eirene's ruptured containment washed over the clearing, the physical violence of the battlefield simply evaporated. It was replaced by a sudden, suffocating, and absolute quiet, the sound of 1,000 iron weapons simultaneously dropping into the moss. Ares, the god of war, who had spent millennia bathing in the glory of slaughter, stopped mid-stride. The colossal maul slipped from his grip, burying its spiked heavy head in the dirt. Ares fell to his knees, his hands flying to the sides of his helm. A horrific, jagged sound tore from his throat, a sound that was half scream, half sob. For the first time in his eternal existence, Ares was not experiencing the adrenaline of the victor. He was experiencing the crushing, localized agony of the vanquished. The psychic wave forced the war god to feel the wet, terrifying heat of a spear piercing his own lung. He felt the cold, creeping paralysis of 1,000 soldiers bleeding out in the mud, crying for mothers who would never know where their sons were buried. He felt the sheer, world-ending grief of the widows left in the ashes of Troy. The divine vanguard collapsed behind him, immortals weeping openly, their minds buckling under the sudden, unfiltered weight of consequence. Athena did not fall, because Eirene had already broken her. Because Athena had spent the last week carrying this exact grief, walking through the dark with the Dryad, learning to bear the terrible arithmetic of suffering. What was unmaking Olympus was the very wisdom Athena had chosen to embrace. The goddess of strategy walked calmly through the paralyzed, weeping ranks of the divine. She reached Ares, who was curled into the loam, clutching at his chest as if his immortal heart were failing. Athena pressed the cold, celestial bronze tip of her spear against the back of his neck. Leave, Athena commanded, her voice ringing with an absolute, chilling clarity. Take your vanguard and crawl back to the mountain. If you remain in these woods, brother, the grief will unmake your divinity. You will drown in the blood you have spilled. Ares did not argue. The god of war scrambled backward, terrified not of Athena's spear, but of his own reflection in the earth's memory. He fled, clawing his way back through the shattered canopy, followed blindly by the weeping host of Olympus. The gods were rooted without a single drop of divine blood being spilled. Athena turned her gaze to the mortal legion. Damon and his men were on their hands and knees in the frost. They were not screaming like the gods, they were sobbing softly, their hands pressed against the bleeding stumps of the outer cedars they had felled. They felt the phantom panic of the nesting birds, the suffocating loss of the sap. Athena walked to her former architect. Damon looked up at her, his face smeared with ash and tears. "I am sorry," the mortal choked out, his voice utterly broken. We did not know what we were killing." "You knew you were killing, Damon," Athena said softly, the harsh judgment tempered by a profound, agonizing sorrow. "You simply chose not to look at the cost. Stand up." Damon swayed as he rose. Athena looked past him toward the dark, freezing mortal encampment. "Take the timber you have already felled," Athena decreed. "Build your walls, feed your children, survive the winter. But the boundary is drawn here, and it is drawn in blood. If humanity ever crosses this tree line again, I will not protect you. I will dismantle your cities stone by stone. You must learn to build without consuming the world." Damon bowed his head, a gesture of absolute, terrified reverence. He signaled his broken men. Leaving their iron axes rusting in the wet moss, the mortals turned their backs on the Grove of Mneme forever. The silence that settled over the forest was profound. It was not the pressurized, heavy silence of the archive. It was just quiet. The ghosts were gone. The compressed memories of 3,000 years had dissipated into the atmosphere. Athena dropped her spear. She fell to her knees at the base of the shattered heart tree. The colossal cedar was dead, split down the middle, and Eirene was gone. Where the Dryad had knelt, there was only a shimmering pile of pale, golden ash. A ragged, mortal sob tore from the goddess of wisdom. Athena plunged her bare hands into the cold ash, her fingers grasping desperately at the soil. She had saved the woods, but she had lost the soul of the forest. The absolute loneliness of eternity threatened to crush her. "Eirene," Athena wept, pressing her ash-stained hands to her face. I remember you." A faint rustle of dry leaves broke the stillness. Beneath Athena's weeping, the golden ash shifted. It did not rebuild the invincible, bark-skinned guardian of the ancient world. The magic of the archive was gone, but the grove was a place of deep, stubborn roots. From the center of the ashes, a warm, soft hand reached out and wrapped around Athena's trembling wrist. Athena gasped, her head snapping up. Lying in the loam, breathing the cold winter air, was Eirene. Her skin was no longer the texture of damp bark. It was soft, flawed, and terrifyingly mortal. The crushing, tar-pit darkness in her eyes was gone, replaced by the clear, bright reflection of the moon. Eirene had sacrificed her immortality and her burden to save the forest, but in doing so, she had untethered herself from the past. She was no longer an archive. She was simply a woman, alive in the present. Eirene smiled, a weak, beautiful thing, and wiped a tear from the goddess's cheek with a soot-stained thumb. "You stayed," Eirene whispered. "I have nowhere else to be," Athena answered, pulling the mortal woman into her arms, burying her face against Irene's warm, beating chest as the first snow of winter began to fall gently through the broken canopy. Epilogue, the last grove of Athena. Centuries turned to ash and dust. The bronze of the ancient world rusted into iron, and the iron was forged into the cold, screaming steel of a new age. Empires rose and collapsed, their kings replaced by industry, their spears replaced by engines. Humanity learned to consume the world with terrifying efficiency, paving over the earth's memory with stone, drowning the skies in smoke, and forgetting the old gods entirely. Yet, on the jagged western coast of Greece, an impossible forest remains untouched by the endless hunger of civilization. It is a sprawling, impenetrable expanse of primordial cedar and black pine that refuses to die. When the architects of the modern world send their machines of fire and steel to harvest the perimeter, the engines inexplicably choke and die. Iron teeth shatter against ancient bark. Men who step too far past the tree line find the air growing impossibly heavy. Their instruments fail. They hear no birds, only the slow, rhythmic beating of a colossal heart beneath the soil. And if they dare to raise an axe, the mist parts, and they find themselves staring at a myth they were taught to forget. They flee, whispering of a guardian in the fog, a towering woman with eyes like a winter storm, wearing battered, soot-stained bronze, holding a spear that hums with the terrifying, localized pressure of a collapsing sky. Athena is no longer the goddess of the city. She is no longer the patron of empire, nor the architect of conquest. She is the feral, uncompromising sentinel of the last wood, and she does not stand alone. Deep within the heart of Mneme, where the suffocating noise of the modern world cannot reach, Eirene breathes. She had surrendered her immortality to break the archive, but a goddess of strategy does not easily surrender what she has bled for. Athena had severed her own remaining ties to the heavens, pouring the vast, endless reservoir of her divine life force directly into the loam, anchoring Eirene's fragile mortal soul to the turning of the seasons themselves. In winter, they rest beneath the great roots, wrapped in the dark, heavy earth, sheltered from the freezing rains. In spring, they walk together, their hands tangled among the blooming night orchids. Eirene no longer carries the weeping ghosts of the past. She is fiercely, radiantly alive in the present, her skin no longer burning with the ash of memory, but warm and flush with mortal blood. They did not build a serene, idyllic garden. They built a bastion. As the mechanical roar of a dying, desperate world presses against the borders of the grove, hungry for the last scraps of untouched earth, Athena stands shoulder to shoulder with the woman who taught her how to grieve. They watch the smoke curl against the edge of the ancient canopy, entirely unafraid. Their existence is the final, undeniable proof that humanity and the earth were never born to be enemies. But they also learned the brutal, ultimate wisdom of survival. True peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the line drawn in the earth, held by a god and a mortal, that the endless hunger of the world is no longer permitted to cross.